Here's something Hollywood doesn't want you to think about. Some horror movies from the 90s didn't just get banned. They dragged the actors down with them, blacklisted, typecast, financially destroyed, and in some cases, erased from the industry entirely. What happens when the film you signed up for turns into the thing that ends your career? These 11 movies are the answer. Está number 11, Mikey, 1992. This film was so disturbing that the UK refused to let anyone see it. Mikey tells the story of a seemingly innocent young boy who murders his way through foster families with a calm, chilling detachment that made censors lose their minds. It arrived right around the time of the James Bulger case in Britain, and the timing could not have been worse. The British Board of Film Classification didn't just reject it, they buried it. The movie never received a home video release in the UK, and it became one of the most notorious banned films of the decade. Brian Bonsall, the child actor who played the title role, delivered a performance that was genuinely unsettling. Critics who saw the film admitted the kid could act. But that was the problem. Bonsall became permanently associated with the image of a child killer on screen, and the controversy made studios deeply uncomfortable about casting him in anything family-friendly afterward. His career, which had included a recurring role on Family Ties and a stint in Star Trek, The Next Generation, began a sharp decline. He drifted away from acting entirely by the mid-90s and later faced a string of personal troubles. The film itself became a collector's item on bootleg circuits, but for Bonsall, Mikey wasn't a cult badge of honor. It was an anchor that dragged him out of an industry that no longer wanted to be associated with the kid who played a pint-sized psychopath on screen. Number 10, Cutting Moments, 1997. Douglas Buck directed this short horror film that played at underground festivals and promptly got itself banned or pulled from multiple venues across Europe and North America. Cutting Moments is only about half an hour long, but the things it depicts, a suburban housewife's descent into extreme self-mutilation, were enough to make even seasoned horror audiences walk out of screenings. The film's power lies in its slow, suffocating build. Nothing happens quickly. The violence, when it arrives, feels less like a horror set piece and more like an endurance test. Nika Ray, who played the lead role, gave what many underground critics called one of the most committed performances in independent horror history. She threw herself into the part completely, but that commitment came at a price. Ray found herself unable to escape the shadow of the role. Casting directors in mainstream film and television didn't want to touch someone associated with imagery that extreme. She continued working in small independent projects, but the kind of career momentum that a performance that powerful should have generated simply never materialized. The film became a whispered legend among horror collectors, traded on VHS tapes and later on obscure DVD compilations. Buck went on to direct more provocative work, but for Ray, the role was a creative peak that simultaneously became a professional ceiling. Hollywood has a short memory for talent, but a very long memory for controversy. And Cutting Moments was nothing but controversy from the first frame to the last. Number 9, Traces of Death, 1993. This pseudo-documentary horror film compiled real and stage footage of death, accidents, and autopsies into a package that was marketed as the most extreme viewing experience money could buy. It was banned in multiple countries and became the kind of thing that got passed around on copied VHS, tapes at sleepovers where someone always claimed they could handle it and someone always couldn't. The narration was handled with a tone of gleeful nihilism that made the whole thing feel even more transgressive. The actors and hosts involved in the Traces of Death series, particularly those who appeared in linking segments and provided voiceover work, found themselves professionally radioactive. Being credited in a film that multiple governments deemed unfit for public consumption is not exactly the kind of resume line that opens doors in Hollywood. Several performers involved in the franchise's multiple sequels throughout the 90s found their names attached to something that distributors, agents, and studios wanted nothing to do with. The series made money on the underground circuit, significant money in fact, but none of that translated into legitimate career advancement for anyone on screen. The franchise became a relic of 90s shock culture, sitting alongside Faces of Death as a rite of passage for teenagers who thought they wanted to see the worst humanity had to offer. For the people who helped make it, Traces of Death was a paycheck that cost far more than it paid. Last number 8. Aftermath, 1994. Spanish filmmaker Nacho Cerda created a 30-minute film that depicted in excruciating and clinical detail what happens to a human body during an autopsy, followed by acts committed upon the corpse that no mainstream distributor would touch. Aftermath was banned or heavily restricted in numerous countries and became one of the most infamous short horror films ever produced. The cinematography was disturbingly beautiful, shot with a precision that made the content even harder to process because it looked like art. Pep Tosar, who played the central figure, delivered a performance that was almost entirely physical, wordless, and deeply committed. The problem was that the performance was so convincing and the subject matter so extreme that Tosar became defined by it in international horror circles. While he continued to work in Spanish-language cinema, any crossover potential into English-language markets evaporated. No American studio wanted to be in business with the lead actor from a film that had been described by one British journalist as the most unwatchable thing ever committed to celluloid. Cerda himself managed to build a respected career and eventually worked on larger projects. But for Tosar, the international notoriety of Aftermath created a wall between his talent and the wider opportunities that talent deserved. The film proved something important about 90s horror. You could create something genuinely artful, technically masterful, and still have it function as career poison simply because the content crossed a line that the mainstream industry refused to acknowledge existed for a reason. Number 7. Der Todesking, 1990. Jörg Buttgereit, the man who gave the world Nekromantik, returned at the start of the decade with this meditation on death and despair, structured as 7 episodes, one for each day of the week. Der Todesking was banned or restricted across most of Europe and never received any kind of wide release in the United States. It's less a traditional horror film and more an art house provocation wrapped in genre clothing, and that combination made it particularly dangerous for the performers involved. The film features multiple actors across its episodic structure, and nearly all of them found their association with Buttgereit's work to be a professional liability outside of the underground scene. The German film industry in the 90s was trying to be taken seriously on the international stage, and actors connected to Buttgereit were effectively marked as too controversial for polite company. One of the film's segments features a man methodically destroying everything in his apartment before the narrative reaches its inevitable conclusion, and the actor's raw portrayal of complete psychological disintegration was praised in underground publications but ignored everywhere else. The performers in Der Todesking became fixtures of cult cinema retrospectives and horror convention panels, but the mainstream German and European film industries kept them at a deliberate distance. Buttgereit himself wore the controversy like armor, building a devoted following that persists to this day. His actors didn't have that luxury. They were foot soldiers in someone else's artistic war, and the casualties were their careers. Number 6. Begotten, 1990. E. Elias Merhage created something that barely qualifies as a movie in any conventional sense. Begotten is a surreal, black-and-white nightmare that opens with a robed figure disemboweling itself and proceeds to get stranger from there. It was shot on reversal film and then reprocessed frame by frame to create an image quality that looks like a recovered artifact from a civilization that worshipped suffering. The film was banned from several festivals, pulled from distribution in multiple territories, and became a legendary piece of underground cinema that people discussed more than they actually watched. The performers in Begotten, including Stephen Charles Barry and Donna Dempsey, are almost unrecognizable beneath the film's extreme visual processing. Their faces, their bodies, everything is obscured by Merhage's relentless manipulation of the image. You'd think this anonymity would protect their careers, but it didn't work that way. Being credited in Begotten meant being associated with something that the mainstream film world viewed as incomprehensible at best, and dangerous at worst. Barry and Dempsey did not go on to significant careers in film. Merhage, fascinatingly, did. He eventually directed Shadow of the Vampire, starring John Malkovich and Willem Dafoe, proving that a director's controversial past can be rebranded as visionary ambition. But the actors from Begotten received no such redemption arc. They remained ghosts in a ghost film, credited participants in one of the most extreme artistic experiments of the decade, forever associated with something that most people in the industry pretended didn't exist. Number 5. Nekromantik 2, 1991, Butgereit Again. This sequel to his 1987 shocker was seized by German authorities shortly after its release, making it one of the very few films in post-war German history to face government confiscation. The charges were glorification of violence, and for a brief period, Butgereit faced the genuine possibility of criminal prosecution. Nekromantik 2 follows a woman who forms an unusual romantic attachment to a corpse while simultaneously pursuing a relationship with a living man, and the film treats this scenario with a deadpan seriousness that makes it even more unsettling than outright exploitation would. Monica M., who played the lead role, delivered a performance that carried the entire film. She was on screen for virtually every frame, and her portrayal was nuanced, complex, and deeply uncomfortable to watch. Critics in the underground scene praised her work extensively, but having your name attached to a film that was literally confiscated by the government is not something you can spin into a positive during a casting meeting. Monica M.'s career in mainstream German cinema never gained traction. She became a cult icon, beloved at horror festivals and celebrated in academic studies of transgressive cinema. But the doors that should have opened for an actress of her obvious ability remained firmly shut. The German government eventually lost its case against the film, and Nekromantik 2 was eventually released uncut. But that legal victory came too late to undo the professional damage. The ban had done its work. The stigma was permanent. Number 4. The Burning Moon, 1992. Olaf Ittenbach directed and starred in this German shot-on-video horror anthology that features some of the most extreme practical gore effects ever committed to tape. The Burning Moon was banned in Germany under their strict media, harmful to young persons legislation, and became a staple of underground tape trading networks across Europe. The film is framed as two stories told by a drug-addicted babysitter to the children he's supposed to be watching, and both stories end in extraordinary displays of handmade splatter that make most Hollywood horror look like a nature documentary. Ittenbach's commitment to practical effects was genuinely impressive from a technical standpoint, and the film developed a passionate cult following. But the performers in The Burning Moon, many of whom were friends and amateur actors recruited from Ittenbach's social circle, found that their participation haunted them professionally. In Germany, being associated with a banned film carried real social consequences during the 90s. It wasn't just about Hollywood doors closing. It was about employers, colleagues, and communities viewing you differently. Several cast members have spoken at conventions about how their involvement in the film created problems in their personal and professional lives that they never anticipated. Ittenbach himself continued making low-budget horror and eventually transitioned into visual effects, work for larger German productions. But the actors who populated his band debut remained trapped in the amber of that association, forever linked to a film that their own country declared unfit for consumption. Number 3. Ostermontag, 1991. This Austrian film, also known by its English title Easter Monday, depicted violence and depravity in a rural setting with such unflinching commitment that Austrian authorities moved swiftly to restrict it. The film arrived during a period when European censors were particularly aggressive about policing extreme content, and Ostermontag became a casualty of that cultural moment. The film's cast, composed primarily of Austrian theater actors who took the roles expecting the kind of artistic freedom that European cinema traditionally offered, found themselves blindsided by the backlash. Austrian theater and film is a relatively small world, and being associated with a banned film in a small industry creates outsized consequences. Several performers saw their theater bookings dry up as artistic directors distanced themselves from the controversy. The film's director leaned into the provocation, giving interviews that framed the ban as proof of his artistic importance. But the actors didn't have that option. They were employees, not auteurs, and the industry treated them accordingly. Reviews from the few critics who saw the film before its restriction noted that the performances were startlingly raw and committed, which only deepened the tragedy of what followed. These were talented performers who did exactly what was asked of them and were punished for it by an industry that valued respectability over artistic courage. Ostermontag became a footnote in the history of European film censorship. But for its cast, it was a chapter that rewrote the trajectory of their entire careers. Number 2. Schramm, 1993. Butgerite's third and final appearance on this list, and arguably his most accomplished film. Schramm tells the story of a lonely taxi driver and serial killer in the final moments of his life, presented through fragmented memories and hallucinatory sequences that blur the line between reality and madness. The film was banned or restricted in multiple countries and has never received a fully uncut mainstream release in several territories. Florian Korner von Gustorf played the title character with a quiet devastation that elevated the material far beyond its exploitation roots. His Schramm is pathetic, terrifying, and heartbreaking in equal measure, and horror scholars have compared the performance to the work of much more celebrated actors in similar roles. But once again, the Butgerite curse held firm. Von Gustorf's association with the film made mainstream casting directors nervous. And despite his obvious talent, he never broke through to wider recognition as a performer. He eventually moved into music production and found considerable success as one half of the production duo behind the band Einstürzende Neubauten's label. But his acting career, the one that should have been launched by a performance this good, never materialized in the way it deserved. Schramm remains one of the great unsung performances in 90s horror, a masterclass in controlled internal acting that happens to exist inside a film that most of the world has been told it cannot see. Von Gustorf's talent survived. His acting career did not. Number 1. Cannibal, 1999. Marion Dora's deeply disturbing entry into extreme German horror arrived at the tail end of the decade and promptly became one of the most controversial films of the entire 90s cycle. Based loosely on rumors and urban legends circulating in Germany at the time that would later prove horrifyingly prescient when the real Armin Meiwes case emerged in 2001, Cannibal depicted consensual acts of extreme violence with a clinical, almost documentary realism that made audiences physically ill at festival screenings. The film was banned in Germany and multiple other European countries almost immediately. The lead actors committed to roles that required them to simulate some of the most disturbing acts ever depicted in fiction film, and they did so with a conviction that left audiences unable to separate performer from performance. That inability became their professional death sentence. Both principal actors found themselves completely shut out of the German and European film industries. Agents dropped them. Auditions stopped coming. The stigma was absolute and immediate. When the Meiwes case broke 2 years later and the real world echoed what the film had depicted, the controversy around Cannibal reignited with even greater intensity, ensuring that anyone associated with it would remain toxic for the foreseeable future. Marion Dora continued making extreme underground horror, building a body of work that is respected in certain academic and genre circles. But his actors paid the price for his vision. Cannibal sits at number 1 on this list because it represents the ultimate cautionary tale. Sometimes the role that demands the most from you is the same role that takes everything away. So there they are. 11 banned horror films from the 90s that didn't just shock audiences, they ended careers. The question nobody seems to ask is this: should actors be punished for doing their jobs too well? Every single person on this list committed fully to their craft, and the reward was professional exile. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Which of these films have you actually seen, and more importantly, do you think the industry was right to blacklist these performers, or did the censors and the studios destroy careers that deserve to thrive? Let me know, and be honest.